underrated or overrated? Guys, we are going to be discussing UFC fighter resumes, active UFC fighters for the most part. This is not a GOAT list, but it's kind of similar. But before I discuss big-time UFC fighters today and whether or not I think that they have an overrated or underrated resume, I'm going to show you guys an example of how not to rate fighter resumes. You know, we often hear the term nostalgia bias, and this is a perfect example. Bring in George St. Pierre. I'm a big fan of George St. Pierre. I'm sure most of you guys are as well, but this is a classic example. I thought it would be a funny clip to start out with of how not to rate resumes. Let's get into this.
Who's in your top five? Nelson Rodriguez Jr. just asked, who's your top five? If you were to name the top five and, the greatest of all time, who would you have on that list?
I think the number one for me is Royce Gracie because, of course, if you put him in the octagon right now, he would not have do so well because sport has changed. But for his time, I think for me, he was the greatest of all time. Things that he have done will never be done again. I mean, maybe not of my living. I think you can put Demetrius Johnson. You can put Mark Coleman, probably. You can put Jon Jones, of course, Anderson Silva, these guys.
Mark Coleman.
Yeah.
Even the freaking valuetainment guy says, Mark Coleman. Really?
Yeah.
Mark Coleman.
Yeah.
Interesting. Really? It's funny how he says that Royce Gracie is the best of all time for his time, which just doesn't make that much sense. But I actually kind of want to hear George St. Pierre's opinion a little bit more on this list.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I used to love them when he won
Wow.
the Pride Grand Prix at the time.
Yeah.
Japan. It was
Mark Coleman in the freaking Pride days. George St. Pierre. I just wanted to mention this before we really get into it. George St. Pierre is falling into the same trap that most fans fall into when they do the GOAT list. And I know some people say there's no point of even talking about the GOAT list. There's no way to definitively add it up. And I kind of disagree. I think that there's ways to determine who's better than who based on resume, based on who you beat. But George St. Pierre falls into the trap of just that nostalgia bias, just being a fan. He loved waking up in the Pride days, just, 5 a.m. Tokyo Dome was open, and George St. Pierre used to turn on his TV. I'm sure he used to go crazy for Mark Coleman. You know what I mean? You can't blame the guy. I was the same guy. Back in the day, used to get up 5 a.m. You guys know how it is. If you guys watched Pride FC back in the day, used to get up, used to turn the TV on, get the clicker, and you'd enjoy your cereal watching some Takayama fights, which was just amazing. But GSP kind of falls into that nostalgia bias a little bit. But let's hear what GSP has to say, and then we'll continue to get into the most overrated and underrated legacies.
when he won the Pride Grand Prix at the time.
Yeah.
Japan. It was
So
he was the
That's
best
literally
of the best.
Mark
the natural
Coleman,
follow-up
though.
to that.
Dude, I'm telling you, I said this back in the day. Why do they hype up these old school guys? George St. Pierre, he'll answer that question. Why does Mark Coleman and Kevin Randleman, why do they get so much hype these days? This is why.
Time.
Yeah.
Japan. It was
So
he was the best of the best.
the natural
Because he was huge. He had the boulder shoulders. He's going back to the days where he watched Superman for the first time. Coleman was huge. He was like a He-Man. That's literally it. As I said back in the day, people got a lot of hype back then because they looked like they were from the salty spittoon, man. They looked like they were kicking people out and sending them over to the Weenie Hut Juniors. They were tough-looking guys. Nostalgia bias, this is what it is, guys. We're not going to be doing any nostalgia bias. We're going to be as objective as possible. Let's actually get into the point of this video, which was overrated, underrated legacies. We're basically going to be talking about resume. And I'm going to be going through each of the divisions and just kind of saying quickly if a fighter has an overrated resume, an underrated resume, or a resume that is properly rated. But guys, let's get into this. The first fighter that we're going to talk about is Jon Jones. I think Jon Jones is just unstoppable, unbeatable marauder. And I just don't think anyone's going to ever pass him. I mean, who's taking second? That's literally what it's like. Who's taking second? Who's taking third? And I honestly think that, people are making it close these days. I actually think that Jon Jones has an overrated resume. Now, this is the thing. As a lot of you guys know already, when I say overrated, what that means is that he is rated higher than he actually should be. I think Jon Jones has a good argument for being the GOAT of the sport. I think what he's done in the cage passes basically everyone else, but only by a little bit. Okay? Now, some fighters, most fighters, by a lot. But the fighters that we talk about in the GOAT conversation, George St. Pierre, Islam Makhachev, Alexander Volkanovski, Volk. Volk's not on Jones's level, but in general, there are people that are close. They're close. That doesn't mean they're there, but they're not far back. They're not miles back. And that's the issue. It's like, don't get this twisted. Just because Yuri Prohaska is about 10 miles behind Jon Jones on the GOAT list doesn't mean that same thing is true for Volkanovski. The same thing is true for Islam Makhachev. Now, we're going to be saying those names quite a bit, but listen. Jon Jones fought tubbies. He fought fat welterweights. Now, people say they were old men. They were not that old. Let's be fair to Jones. They were not all that old. It's not like Jones, when he first became a champ, was fighting 50-year-olds. He was fighting guys that were in their prime years. It's just that he was young in comparison. Fair enough, they looked like they just got off their holidays. Jon Jones is fighting people that looked like they had just taken their Christmas break and had gained 20 pounds, like basically 170 pounds, but happened to be fighting at 205 and had been eating a lot, but he had a huge size advantage over his opponents. But then towards the second half of his career, he ended up leveling the playing field, taking on DC, same size, same reach, same age, and things were all fair. Nah, I'm joking. But in general, Jones, I don't think he's that far ahead from other people. Like, if he beats Stipe Miocic, I think that actually, listen, Stipe's a weird one, but I actually think Stipe's gaining some aura right now. So if that'll be a decent win, I think guys like Islam Makhachev gets 2 more wins. I think he might be the GOAT of the sport. Okay, and we're gonna talk about this. I think that guys in the lightweight classes who face the best levels of competition in the modern era are not that far off. They're not that far off. And people are going to say, what are you saying, man? Jon Jones, he fought freaking Scottie Pippen, and he fought Jones, you get every single name you bring up for Jon Jones. It's like Scottie Pippen, man. He fought Shogun Rua. All these guys, like legends, dinosaur names, literally sounding like dinosaurs. Shogun Rua, that's like a dino name. And I'm like, man, I'm sorry, bro, but Jones has a great resume, but Anthony Smith, that can only do so much for your legacy. Okay, so where are we gonna put that? I don't know. Definitely not. That's not a name that even nudges you in this conversation. So that, some of these wins don't even matter. And then the Reyes fight, dude, that's a loss. That's a loss. The Reyes fight is a loss, but he's got a couple of those. My point is, I think it's a little bit overrated. This guy is the GOAT of the sport, in my opinion. If he beats Stipe, I personally think that Stipe is getting tougher as we speak. You know how Stipe is. Stipe is one of those guys, he could be 50, 60 years old. There's always a 4th round body shot TKO chance that guy has. I think Jones is probably going to twist him into a pretzel in the first round and finish him, but I do think that Stipe is actually a little bit underrated right now. I think that Jones beating him is actually a good win. But we're talking someone right now in the UFC is 3 wins away. They're 3 wins away. That's, I don't think he's insurmountable as far as the GOAT conversation goes. I don't think that Jon Jones's resume will never be passed. I think 5 years from now, yeah, I think we'll have a new GOAT of the sport. Okay, let's get on to the next one. Who's another guy? I guess we'll just talk about him right now, Islam Makhachev. I think that Islam Makhachev is literally a couple wins away from becoming the GOAT of the sport. So I have to say he has a underrated legacy, underrated resume. People rarely even talk about Islam Makhachev as like a top 10 fighter. Islam Makhachev, to the average fan, real hardcore fans will say, yeah, there's an argument this guy's definitely top 10 right now. The average fan, if you're bringing up Islam Makhachev in the GOAT conversation, I'm just thinking of Nick Pete for whatever reason. That's the BT Sport guy. I could just hear Nick Pete, and this is just a random MMA fan. Islam Makhachev is slowly building his resume, And this is a terrible Nick Pete impression. And he could be a couple years away from being in that conversation. That's what they're saying. They're saying things like, and Islam Makhachev, he could be a couple years away from that conversation. He's a couple years away from that conversation. Okay? The conversation of being in the top 10, which is freaking ridiculous. All right? Islam Makhachev is not a couple years away from being in the conversation. You're a fucking 5 years late. You're 5 years late. This guy was the GOAT last year. No, I'm joking. He's not the GOAT yet, but you're freaking late, okay? You're like 2 years late talking about he's a couple years away. No one even, like, I'm making up these freaking arguments, but I know people think like this. Islam Makhachev is here, bro. He's already a fucking top 10 fighter ever. There's no argument against it. He beat Volkanovski in his prime. That version of Volk that he fought was the best version of Volkanovski ever, maybe. Okay? And then Volk in his very next fight. I know people forget about the Yair win, but he beat Yair. So it's not like he beat a war. People, dude, like I could see people saying things like he beat a washed up Volkanovski after he got knocked. People are fucking crazy with the way that they talk about this guy. Islam Makhachev is the one that washed Volk, okay? He beat Volk 1.5 times. I'm not really counting that second one as like a full win because it was fat Volk. Listen, people say like Topuria beat a bad version of Volk. Nonsense. Topuria beat one of the best Volks ever. Maybe Volk shouldn't have been fighting, but the way he actually looked on the night of the fight, that was literally one of the best Volkanovskis the world has ever seen. Volk's striking looked insane in that fight. His defense, not so amazing, but his offensive striking speed, it all looked good. Islam Makhachev beat Volk in Australia, and he didn't even have a huge weight advantage. Like, I believe their in-cage weights were very similar. And he has a win over Charles Oliveira. And back in the day, we used to compare that win over Charles Oliveira to Khabib and all this stuff. It's like, dude, now he has a win over Dustin Poirier, who's Khabib's best win. And he's got Arman Tsarukyan. And he's got Dan Hooker. And maybe last year we would sit here and say a Dan Hooker win and we would laugh at it. Dan Hooker just beat Mateusz Gamrot. Dan Hooker just beat Gamrot. Okay? And he's still in the top 10. And he's on a 3-fight win streak. Bobby Green. He beat King Green, man. But you guys get my point. Drew Dober. Islam Makhachev beat Arman already, and he's about to beat him again. And if he beats him again, he's literally one win away from maybe being the fucking GOAT of the sport. Okay? That's an insane resume, but people are going to say, dude, Islam hasn't done shit yet. Like, who are you going to have in your top 5 then? Anderson Silva? Get out of here. Okay? Let's talk about Charles Oliveira. I think Charles Oliveira's resume, time will tell. Time will tell. But will it, though? Because he's going to fight the same guy he already beat, and it's going to be the worst version of Michael Chandler the world has ever seen. Charles Oliveira, let's talk about his wins. Justin Gaethje, who is a good fighter. He's a great fighter. I'm not going to have the recency bias and just, flatlined Gaethje is the only version of Gaethje that I can think of right now. No, Gaethje is a great fighter, but he's not on Poirier's level. Let's not act like Gaethje and Poirier, they're the same caliber of wins. His best win is over Dustin Poirier. Okay, the Beneil Dariush win, that's a pretty good win. But I honestly don't even think Beneil Dariush should be ranked right now. I mean, I guess technically he should, but the guy never fights. And, the way we feel about Justin Gaethje is Justin Gaethje lost all his aura. Beneil Dariush, I mean, you may as well have had 10 of those point-down knockout losses that Gaethje had for what Beneil's currently, I guess, orbiting around, which might be the lowest aura in the UFC. Beneil was a good win. I don't even know if that's a Justin Gaethje win. And then a Chandler win? Chandler doesn't have that's a good win. But after those, okay, Chandler, Beneil, Gaethje, Poirier's an amazing win. After those, there's not that many to talk about. There's not even a lot of those Drew Dober type of wins or Dan Hooker type of wins or even Bobby Green type of wins. We're talking about Giagos. We're talking about, it's hard to even bring up the names. Kevin Lee. Listen, I think Charles Oliveira has a good resume. I just think it might be slightly overrated. With people saying like Charles Oliveira, second best lightweight ever, still behind Khabib. Like I think that at this point, I think it's pretty clear I don't know if that's true. Okay, and I honestly think that there's a case for Poirier being ahead of him. Now, again, overrated does not mean he doesn't have a great resume. I mean, again, all these guys that we're talking about are like some of the best fighters ever. But I think Charles's resume is just slightly overrated because people will talk about it as, and then Oliveira, just the win streak, the streak that he had. It was a good streak, but I think people like Bilal have better win streaks before getting a title shot. Speaking of Bilal Muhammad, let's talk about Bilal Muhammad. I think he has an underrated resume. I think he has a very underrated resume. Let's talk about that streak since I'm comparing it to the likes of Charles Oliveira. Well, first off, he beat Wonderboy on that win streak, totally destroyed Wonderboy, and damaged him really badly on the ground. We rarely ever see anyone do that to him on the ground. Gilbert Burns couldn't do it. Shavkat Rakhmonov submitted him, fair enough, but he couldn't really damage him or anything like that. Bilal beat Wonderboy. He beat Vicente Luque. Okay? He beat, and that was a good version of Vicente Luque that was on a bit of a streak as well. He also beat, I'm forgetting, Damian Maia. All right? That was a few years ago. That was like 2021 on the Adesanya Vittori card. Beat Damian Maia. At the time, that was an okay win, even though it was an old Damian Maia. He also beat, I can't believe I'm forgetting, Sean Brady. And we saw what Sean Brady did recently. Okay? We saw what Sean Brady did to Gilbert Burns. So that win is aging really well. Bilal Muhammad TKO'd him. Leon Edwards, the guy that beat Kamaru Usman twice, which is an extremely good win. And Leon has a Colby win on his resume, which makes Bilal's win over Leon that much better. And I'm not saying Colby's the best win ever, but I'm just saying Bilal beat, Leon Edwards. And I'm just mentioning that about Leon because people act like his only wins are over Kamaru. Not necessarily true. Bilal beat the guy that a lot of us, including myself, thought may go on to pass Kamaru Usman. The guy has an amazing resume. It is really good. It's solid. He's on a crazy win streak right now. I just think it's a little bit underrated, right? I think it's a little bit underrated. Maybe rated properly by the hardcore fans. Let's talk about another fighter, Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje's resume. Let's talk about it. So he's got a Michael Chandler win. He's got a Tony Ferguson win. He's got a Rafael Fiziev win. And he's got a... honestly, I think Gaethje's resume right now, I actually think it's underrated. Slightly underrated. Okay? And this is why. I could see people saying things like, who is Justin? To be honest, he's only knocked out old men. He's only knocked out Cowboy and James Vick. Tony Ferguson, first guy to snap the win streak. Dustin Poirier knocked him out. Rafael Fiziev. Everyone was doubting Gaethje going into that fight because he got sent flying across the octagon by Charles Oliveira. And then who else are we talking about that I just mentioned as well? Michael Chandler. Really good win that Justin Gaethje had on his resume. Michael Johnson back in the day, that was a pretty good win. Cowboy Cerrone at the time, it wasn't a bad win. I believe he beat Cowboy, who was on a streak. Okay, Edson Barboza, a few years back, right? 2019, Edson Barboza. Or was that 2020? I believe that was 2019 or 2018. That's a great win. I think Gaethje actually has an underrated legacy. Now, I've been hearing people saying, but really, what has Gaethje really done? It's like, well, he has 6 of these great wins. So, yeah, I think Gaethje has a slightly underrated resume in 2024. Okay? But let's move on to another fight. Ilia Topuria, underrated resume. Very underrated. Now, people might hear this and they may think I'm crazy, but I actually think Ilia Topuria is one win away from arguably being a top 10 fighter of all time, just based on having some insane all-time wins. Talking about Volkanovski, and I know people are going to say, oh, it was washed up past prime Volkanovski. He literally had a win over Yair Rodriguez 6 months prior. 6 months before that was maybe the best he's ever looked in the octagon against Islam Makhachev. So I don't know if he was totally washed up. He looked pretty fast to me. That punch that he knocked him out with literally would have knocked out any version of Volkanovski. So he has a Volk win. And what else? What else? He also may have the Max Holloway win. If he beats Max Holloway, that's insane. Max Holloway, one of the best fighters ever as well. You don't need that many wins if you have insane names on your resume. And he's got a Josh Emmett and a Bryce Mitchell wins. He's got those as well. Which, to be honest, we're looking at other fighters like Habib. Let's talk about Habib real quick. this is the thing. We'll talk about Topuria. We'll say, this he's just not done enough, man. Well, talk to me when you got through more defenses, man. And then we'll talk about Khabib. Outside of Conor, Dustin, and Gaethje, okay, is a win over Edson Barboza that much different than Josh Emmett? Yes, man. It is, man. Edson Barboza was an absolute marauder, man. Edson Barboza, if you actually look at his record, he didn't have like the most dominant run. Edson Barboza got beat by a lot of people. Giga Chikadze, see what he did to him. Bryce Mitchell had a better performance against Edson Barboza than Khabib did. Listen, Edson Barboza is a great fighter. I just hyped up Justin Gaethje for beating him. My point is, Josh Emmett's a bad man too. And I think that win over Josh Emmett's pretty good, okay? I think that Edson might be slightly better than Emmett, but my point is, it's not that far off. It's not that far off. And Bryce Mitchell, we're talking about Khabib. I actually think Bryce Mitchell's arguably better than Michael Johnson. So they're on par. And outside of that, of course, Topuria doesn't have crazy wins, but listen, I think this guy is a couple wins away from being top 5. I don't think winning against Max makes him top 5, but he's a couple away from being up in that conversation, The things that people say about Islam Makhachev, he's a couple years away from being in that conversation. Topuria is like a couple, he's like a year and a half away from being in the conversation. He does actually need a couple more, but I think he's got an underrated resume. Merab, extremely underrated resume. Let's talk about Merab. Merab may have one of the most underrated resumes in MMA right now because Merab might literally be the bantamweight GOAT. And that's just how it is. I know that people aren't going to like that. But if you think about it, Dominic Cruz, is he really the bantamweight ruling over the GOAT conversation for that division with an iron fist? I don't think so. I don't think Dominic Cruz is someone that is not going to be passed. The bantamweight GOAT list is very weird because everyone's pretty close together. But I think Merab's win over Sean O'Malley, it wasn't as dominant as people like to make it out to be. But I do think he beat Sean O'Malley. I do think he won that fight 3-2, even though it was very close. And if you beat Sean O'Malley, who was a champion, who had defended his belt, and you also 50-45 Peter Yan, and you also beat Jose Aldo a few years back, and Aldo was on a crazy win streak, one fight away from a title at the time. And who else did he beat? Marlon Moraes. So he beat Peter Yan, who is a top 5 bantamweight ever. Sean O'Malley, who is in the mix. He's in the conversation. You could basically say he beat Aljamain Sterling. He was the guy tossing him around in the gym. I'm joking. I don't actually know if that's the case, but I always got the vibe that Merab was the real champ. You know what I mean? He was just letting Aljo be champ, but maybe not. Merab beat Sandhagen too. He didn't actually beat Sandhagen. You may as well just throw Sandhagen into the mix. It's like, it's one of those things. After Sandhagen's last performance, you may as well just say Merab beat him too. Even though that sounds crazy, but Merab's resume is insane. Peter Yan has one of the most underrated resumes in UFC history too. Let's talk about Peter Yan. Arguably beat Sean O'Malley, beat Corey Sandhagen, beat Jose Aldo, a really good version of Aldo, like before Aldo went on an insane win streak at bantamweight too, which just proves Aldo wasn't washed up at the time. And Peter Yan also beat Jimmy Rivera back in the day. He beat Song Yadong. Peter Yan has a shitload of amazing wins. He beat Aljamain Sterling in their first fight. I don't care what anyone says. Even if that fight wasn't, decisive because of the knee, at the end of the day, Peter Yan won 3 out of the 4 rounds. That knee landed at the end of the 4th round. Peter Yan was whooping his ass, and they're both fighters. They were competing against each other. And I saw them compete, and I saw Yan get the better of Aljamain Sterling on the night of a fight that they had prepared for 3 months. I'm actually going to count Yan as winning that fight. So yeah, I think beating Yan is insane for Merab. And I also think beating Sean O'Malley when he was the underdog is pretty good as well. Oh, and he beat Jose Aldo, who's the top 10 fighter of all time. Yeah, Merab might literally be the GOAT of bantamweight. And he has a bunch of other wins too. And I know that you guys might scoff at those other wins, but it's like, Dominic Cruz's other wins, after the big ones that you can name, are similar to Merab's other wins. Adesanya. I think Adesanya has a slightly overrated resume. I think it's slightly overrated, guys. I think that a lot of people would put him in their top 15. And to that, I say you're out of your fucking mind. Okay? Just because of that, I just still think people might have him in their top 15. I'd say more than 50% of MMA fans would have Izzy in their top 15. Izzy could lose 20 times in a row. And by the way, I think, Adesanya, as time goes on, I think he's better and better for the UFC. I think his performance against Dricus was really good. I still think he's good. He actually looked better than I thought he was going to look in that last fight. But he could lose 20 times and people would still find a way to say, and Adesanya obviously top 15 all time, which is just not the case. So I think a little bit overrated. Kamaru Usman, to be fair, the Colby wins are actually kind of good because Colby these days is horrible and didn't even look like he was, capable of putting up a fight against Scraggly, the homeless guy, in his last fight. I still think that Colby, when Kamaru fought him, was really good. Gilbert Burns was a good win. Woodley at that point was kind of resting on his laurels a little bit. Woodley was starting to feel the love from the fans. You remember in 2018, going into the Darren Till fight, that's when the fans finally started sort of liking Woodley. And when he beat Darren Till, that's when Woodley really became like, all right, we've been shitting on this guy. We've been going back and forth with this guy. And Tyron Woodley was a bit of a salty Walty back in the day, but going into the Usman fight, Woodley was like, all right, now the fans accept him. Now Woodley's chilling, and now he's like, people want Woodley to achieve GOAT status at this point. And Kamaru beat him. Kamaru whooped his ass. I actually think Kamaru's resume is probably, he did beat Leon back in the day. So let's just say that. Let's not act like he doesn't have a win over Edwards. That's like Islam's win over Arman. I think Usman's resume is actually, I think it's probably as good as people say it is. All right. I think that there's an argument that it's top 10. It's at the very least top 15. Is he top 5? Is he on Volk's level? Maybe not. But but I think it's pretty good. I actually don't think it's that overrated. I think people these days are saying it's kind of overrated. I actually don't think it's that overrated. But if we're talking top 5, you're going too far. Yeah, I guess we may as well talk about Volk. You guys already know, but people still don't know. All right? You guys may have heard Volkanovski is still underrated on the GOAT list. People still don't understand, and I'm saying this before the Holloway-Topuria fight, and this may not age well, because if Topuria makes Holloway look easy, then this isn't going to age that well. But people still don't understand how impressive it is to beat Max Holloway 3 times. Okay? Let me just say this. You want to come up with a nightmare opponent for a guy like Volk who doesn't necessarily have that crazy KO power? Let's talk about a guy that has great takedown defense. So Volkanovski, the wrestler, Volk, he's not really a wrestler first, but Volk can wrestle. He does the specifics training. Max Holloway's got great takedown defense. So things get tough, okay? Good luck taking down Max and beating him up like you did to Ortega. Not going to happen. Out-voluming Max Holloway, that's going to be pretty difficult. All right, Max Holloway, best volume hunter ever. Cardio, Max Holloway, that's not an issue for him. Cardio's never been an issue for Max. It's been a strength. Boxing, yeah, it's going to be tough too. Toughness knocking him out, impossible. Just not going to happen. Later rounds, good luck. That's where Max starts his avalanche. And Volk beat him 3 times in 5-rounders. 3 times by decision. I think beating Max 3 times by decision is arguably the most impressive feat in MMA history. Okay? Islam Makhachev had 1 fight against Volk. A half a fight against a half a Volk, which I don't really count that. It's a win. I don't count it that much. I mean, I count it, but it's just the second fight he had against Volk. Fair enough. That's a great KO. That's awesome. But congrats on your first win over Volk. Let's keep it at that. Dricus Du Plessis, underrated resume. Let's just say that. That's the one I'm going to leave off on. Underrated resume. Alex Pereira, I think his resume is rated properly. At this point, I think most people agree he's top 10 all time. Dricus Du Plessis, Whitaker win. Knocked out Whitaker. He's got a Strickland win. Very, very close fight, but still, that's pretty good. He's also got a Darren Till win, which, has some aura. Darren Till is one of those wins where it's like, okay, maybe it wasn't the best win ever, but, a Darren Till win, that's a big fight. That's a big name. Kind of similar to the way people will rank, like, you know, Ronda Rousey on the GOAT list. They'll say things along the lines of she did everything for the sport. You know, Darren Till had those moments in his career. He had those moments. They're just the aura moments where it's kind of like, okay, good win for Dricus. Okay? I'm a big fan of Darren Till. And then he's got a win over Izzy. Okay? Submitted Izzy, knocked out Rob, decisioned Strickland. Pretty freaking great. I think he's actually knocking on that doorstep of Anderson Silva. He's getting pretty close. I know people are really going to dislike that, but it's actually true. All right? It's actually true. His resume is crazy. And he's not just beating Whitaker and Adesanya that are totally old and washed up. Adesanya is not washed. He's a middleweight. He's getting up there for a middleweight, but he's not washed. Same thing for Whitaker. Whitaker, 2 wins after that. He's on a 2-fight win streak. So these guys aren't washed. And of course, Sean Strickland, who's in his early 30s. Darren Till, Darren Till may have been a little bit washed up for him. Fair enough. But I think he's got a pretty underrated resume. I look forward to doing my GOAT video. The GOAT video is going to come after Holloway versus Topuria, 100%. I'm looking forward to doing a revised top 15 all-time list. But I'm also going to do a fantasy matchups video, champion edition, you know, Islam Makhachev versus Royce Gracie, stuff like that. Maybe a little bit of Fedor Emelianenko versus some of the modern day guys. Like, I think Fedor versus Curtis Blades might not end so well for Fedor. Okay, but my point is, I'm going to do one of those as well. What other matchups are we going to have to do in that video? We're probably going to do a Demetrius Johnson versus a Pantoja. That would be a good one. So hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time.